Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Peter Meintjes. With me are Grant Gibson, CFO, and Chris Gallaher, Chairman of Pacific Edge. We're going to discuss this morning the latest news regarding the Novitas LCD in this investor presentation. Important notice and disclaimer. All right, we just thought it was useful to revisit the timeline associated with how we have ended up where we have ended up. Pacific Edge received a notice of coverage back in July 2020, and then after a substantial period of uninterrupted reimbursement with very high success, there was a proposal in July 22 where they would have seen that we were unable to interpret at the time, and after we asked some questions, we recognised that there was some risk to Pacific Edge. We went through the process of open meetings. We set up contingency planning, and during that period, we also noticed that triage was added to the list of reliably reimbursed tests that we had from Medicare. In June 2023, we then first saw a finalized version that included an evidentiary review of our tests and understood to a greater extent Novitas's position on some of our tests. However, because there was a substantial amount of content on a final version that was not in the prior draft, we pursued legal avenues and were able to have that reset. And Novitas put an identical LCD out in July and agreed to follow the appropriate procedure for notice and comments on the LCD, and Medicare coverage continued. In August through May of 2024, we followed the procedure. We were involved in the open comment period. We had substantial support from various clinicians, AUA, industry lobby groups. And also during that period, we engaged directly with CMS, as we've highlighted for investors before. We also engaged with the Office of the General Counsel, and we also had some milestones specifically, we published the strata data. And we also documented Novitas's agreement to review our the PowerPoints that we submitted to them in the January meeting that we had, and strata. We were surprised when CMS granted an extension, where it appeared that Novitas had not followed the appropriate timelines and the mandated timelines. And as we pursued inquiries in August and September, we got very poor answers from Novitas and CMS about the reasons for any extension, and we continued to push for retirement of the LCD during this period. But we also achieved another milestone of publishing additional analytical validation that addressed some of their concerns around the foundational validity of our tests. And then, of course, the news last week that Novitas has finalized an LCD under a new name, which is genetic testing and oncology for specific tests, and that is where we are now. So the key findings, there are some substantial changes from the previous version. The most significant is one that doesn't play a big role for Pacific Edge, but there has been a substantial change from Novitas's side in that they are no longer using this LCD to rely on third-party databases and compendia. I want everybody to take from this that this was actually the foundational reason that the LCD was created in the first place, was to give Novitas a path to use third-party databases. So the core of their proposal has been removed, even though that is not the thing that has consequences for Pacific Edge. Of direct consequence to Pacific Edge is that the finalized LCD no longer preemptively non-covers our non-commercial tests. That's Cxbladder Resolve and Cxbladder Triage Plus, that are not covered tests. And again, it's an important disambiguation here. Here, while we have changed our name for Detect Plus to Triage Plus, they are referring to a non-commercial, non-published version of Triage Plus that appears in a paper from 2022. So that's not an immediate path to recovery. Finalized LCD has also been reduced to, so it has simply been reduced to an evidentiary review of 12 tests, including Cxbladder, and it contains some unfavorable language, specifically saying that Cxbladder tests are non-payable and not medically reasonable and necessary to support positive outcomes in the management of bladder cancer. And it will surprise no one that we hotly refute those claims, as do our supporters within the AUA, LUGPA, and the AACU. The finalized LCD repeats a number of concerns that were detailed in the original draft. The most substantial are that they are conflating hematuria evaluation with screening, potentially redefining the screening in a way that's incompatible with the Social Securities Act. They've also, as a consequence of the incorrect framing of our test as a screening test, there's insufficient validation and confounding clinical circumstances. So they are asking our test to do something it wasn't designed for, and consequently finding it doesn't do them. This is highly objectionable in my view, and the grounds for continued exasperation on our side, but also knowing that we have something of value underneath. So it continues to question the credibility of Pacific Edge funded research, but also acknowledges that there is a significant body of independent research that supports that. So we view that as largely irrelevant. Importantly, though, and on the top of your minds and mine, is that Medicare is Pacific Edge's largest payer. It is substantial. It is the largest opportunity. And while we don't have all our eggs in one basket, this is a single point of failure for our single largest market has meant a single point of focus for us and making sure that we get this right. And as at this stage, this is obviously significant news, bad news. So, look, with all that in mind, Novitas continues to misunderstand the value of Cxbladder, and there continue to be significant structural issues with what they have proposed, even with the reduced scope of L 39365. It appears to misunderstand the intended patient population. We do not screen the general population. We do not screen healthy individuals. We are focused on the risk stratification of hematuria patients that have presented at the GP's office and subsequently the urology office with hematuria. That is the role of Triage and Detect. And of course, there's no question about the role of Monitor in surveilling non-muscle invasive bladder cancer patients. Despite assurances in writing from Novitas, they have failed to consider new peer-reviewed evidence. Again, we find that objectionable. The Strata randomized control study published in July, sorry, that date is incorrect. It was published online in May, which demonstrated the clinical utility of Cxbladder Triage was not considered. The analytical validation of Cxbladder Detect, Triage, and Monitor published in September 24, despite assurances from Novitas, was also not reviewed. So it does not acknowledge an editorial that was also provided directly to Novitas. The representations on the draft LCD, excuse me, and it also does not acknowledge a number of the representations on the draft from the AUA, LUGPA, AACU, C21, and ACLA in support of our tests. So there are repeats in the fraud analysis, specifically the Holyoke paper, which without getting too technical, the Holyoke paper is a biomarker discovery paper. It is intended only to show that there are biomarkers that may be involved in bladder cancer. It is not intended as a test development paper. It is clear from Novitas's evidentiary review that they expect of that paper things that it was not intended for. And consequently, they have reached the wrong conclusions. It's also explicit that they are that they appeared. It does not explicitly clarify when we asked for in a comment for them to establish whether hematuria is or is not a substantiated suspicion of disease. If it is not, this LCD is not appropriate for a non-coverage determination. And if it is, then they have analysed it in an incorrect paradigm. So again, we expect to pursue this with vigour, given the substantial nature of the errors they've made. We have prepared for this outcome. We have noted Novitas seems to have a behaviour pattern of not working on an LCD for a substantial period of time and then rushing to a finish line. So their prior underwhelming analyses are things that there was always a possibility that they would get this wrong, and we are prepared for it. So we have refocused the business on clinical evidence development for guidelines inclusion and increased coverage certainty. You've heard me say this many times. We have restructured our commercial operations to focus on profitable territories, and we'll do our best to continue to do so. We have adjusted our selling focus towards the clinical value of Cxbladder, and the company is well placed to fund the recoverage process if necessary and regain reimbursement of our tests. So setting a path to regaining Medicare coverage. These are all at this stage, you might imagine, these are all potential avenues, and our contingency plans include a potential legal challenge to the LCD on procedural and fairness grounds, further review of the structure of our operations and our strategy to reduce cash burn, and our plan to regain Medicare coverage. We will continue to, obviously, the first of those is fairly adversarial. The third of these in the bullet here to submit a reconsideration to request to Novitas is essentially to follow process and accept this outcome, but to provide them with the evidence that they already have, that they already said they would review, and give them another opportunity to consider that evidence on their own timeframe as part of a reconsideration request. To continue to advance our clinical evidence generation program, as we have done. We are being non-covered on the basis of, in my view, flawed analysis, but on the basis of flawed analysis of clinical evidence. And this underpins the importance of our continued push for guidelines inclusion in an AV-CV-CU framework to the AUA and NCCN. We will continue to work with our partners, most notably at Kaiser Permanente, but there are others that will continue to publish independent evidence that validates the performance of our test, and to continue to explore other strategic alternatives so that Pacific Edge can ultimately prosper, regaining Medicare coverage and advancing the commercialization of Cxbladder globally. We've published this a number of times, and importantly, we are ever closer to various milestones here, and to my team, many of whom will be listening today. This remains our focus. We will continue to publish, and we will continue to give ourselves the best shot of recoverage, or given the situation, with the evidence program that we have in place. Again, highlighting the value of real-world and independent evidence. Our partnership with Kaiser is important. I received news earlier today that an abstract that has been submitted to the AUA by Kaiser Permanente has been accepted for publication. Has been accepted for a poster presentation at the AUA meeting in April next year. Again, highlighting that the work that we're doing with Kaiser Permanente is very, very important, not just from a revenue standpoint, but from an ongoing collaboration and partnership standpoint, and that we will ultimately prevail with overwhelming evidence about the value of our tests. Another impending milestone is potential inclusion in the AUA hematuria guidelines. As you know, the AUA embarked on a comprehensive review back in September, or in September it was announced for peer review. So it is while we have no direct understanding of where they are in that process, we do understand that the AUA guidelines update will essentially be handled in its closing stages like any other publication that goes into the AUA's Journal of Urology. And once it is completed, author review and peer review, it will find its way into a print edition of the Journal of Urology. But prior to that, it will be available online as soon as it is accepted for publication. And we anticipate the new guidelines at any time, and we are optimistic that Cxbladder will have some role in the new microhematuria guidelines based on the strength of the strata evidence that they have considered. Clear and positive inclusion language, of course, is very meaningful, particularly in this situation, which would be used as a basis for Medicare recoverage request. So by way of summary and outlook, look, we are obviously extremely disappointed that our efforts to date have not resulted in a favorable outcome here, but we have prepared for it, and we are resolved to fix this. We will focus on the available legal and appeals avenues in the next 45 days. We will continue our evidence generation focus until recoverage. The company is well placed to fund the recoverage process if necessary and regain reimbursement for our tests. There may be some additional headwinds. And to my sales colleagues who will encounter some objections from customers, focus, stay strong, deal with the objections. So far, Pacific Edge has never lost coverage. We've only been proposed to lose coverage. And so continue your good work. But there may be some negative response from customers. There may be some negative physician or patient response regarding any expansion we consider to our patient responsibility program. But importantly, there are more catalysts and headwinds ahead for Pacific Edge. And while this is clearly a zenith, potential inclusion of the AUA in guidelines for the microhematuria within the AUA is a big one for us. Reconsideration of already published clinical evidence, Strata and AV, those are the big ones. Reconsideration of new clinical evidence. We maintain our trajectory to publish the analytical validation of Triage Plus, and we are on track for a drive publication for Triage Plus as well. We will enter a gap fill process for Triage Plus pricing, and it is important to the future of the business that a successful gap fill at a higher price will be quite meaningful because it will improve not just the revenue, but also the margin and the margin percentage. As discussed, new clinician-generated clinical utility evidence is also important, and there remains the possibility of litigation success through the channels that we are considering. So with that, it's a short presentation today. We are open for questions. I'll let our technical team handle that. If you've submitted online, Grant will ask me those questions, and myself, Grant, and Chris Gallaher are all available to answer questions directed at us. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those on the phones, before we take our first question, a reminder to join the queue, please press *1 on your phone keypad. And your first question on the phones comes from the line of Rob Morrison from Craigs Investment Partners. Please go ahead.
Good morning, guys. Can you hear me?
Hey, Rob.
Cool.
And indeed.
First of all, obviously, sorry to hear the news. There's two parts to my question. So there's obviously a really broad range of possible outcomes. And can you please run us through what you see as the base case for getting coverage back? So second part to the question is in the slide deck, I think you mentioned before, you say the company is well placed to fund the recoverage process if necessary and regain reimbursements. So as a base case, do you have sufficient cash to get back to coverage?
So it depends largely on which path to coverage ultimately eventuates. Of course, the statement's inherently true. If we're able to overturn this through a legal proceeding, as we were successful 18 months ago, and as we have been successful in getting various things out of this LCD. So, we will continue through those avenues, and so that statement is automatically true if we're able to retire this LCD through ongoing dialogue with Novitas, CMS, and the OGC. But I think the question, drilling to the heart of your question, is which of the clinical publications do we expect addresses all of Novitas's concerns to get us recoverage? And firstly, we find it almost impossible to understand how, if we have guidelines language that Novitas could continue to non-cover the test. They, in fact, in their LCD, leave open the avenue that they looked at the recent guidelines for the guideline update for non-muscle invasive bladder cancer patients, which mentioned monitor as a future direction, and they mentioned that as evidence to non-cover monitor, which means they are at least willing to consider AUA guidelines as part of why they should pay for a test. So we view that as again extremely compelling evidence. And again, if that is our path, that statement's going to be true straight away. Again, should we either not have AUA guidelines language, or AUA guidelines language is somehow not sufficient to address all of their concerns, it depends on the reconsideration requests for primarily drive. That is the strongest. That is the first strongest publication that we need to get out for, in our view, for recoverage. So that's the one you can pay attention to. Does that answer all your questions, Rob, or do you have any follow-on?
Yeah, I don't want to be a question hog. I maybe got one or two more, if that's right.
Today you're ask what you need.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So just on that, because for the guidelines, there's a pretty, at the moment it recommends against. So there's a wide range of possible upgrades to that. Any idea what the minimum positive recommendation would be in order for you to get coverage back from Novitas? Would it be, for example, consider or something along those lines?
So, look, it's a very difficult question to answer, but we do believe that any kind of product-specific language that is based on level 1 evidence, like the Strata publication, should be sufficient. Where it's more likely to be narrow is in the eligible patients. So, and that comes down to what does the clinical evidence say today about triage. And so, if I would say the strongest case for guidelines inclusion language and subsequent coverage on the basis of guideline inclusion language exists for triage based on the Strata publication, and in low-risk hematuria patients. But they would make my intuition is that they would make a product-specific recommendation if they go down the path of reevaluating the guidelines as they are.
Got it. Thank you. And so on that preliminary injunction and legal challenge, it seems that you think there's a possibility that could halt the finalization of the LCD.
So the intent of a preliminary injunction is to halt the LCD from ever coming into effect. So if we believe we can be successful with that, then we will do that. If there's no point to a preliminary injunction if you can't if the goal is not to stop the LCD from coming into effect in its totality. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yep, for sure. And then final question, because it sounds like you've got a few options before you, obviously, but it sounds like your best path forward is to just keep generating this evidence, trying to get into guidelines, and taking advantage of legal where you can, but that will very much be a secondary strategy to the generation of evidence. Is that right?
Yeah, so look, the standard path is the standard path. It's generate good analytical validation, and clinical utility, and so your evidence generation program, and then that will lead to both coverage and guidelines. You typically need clinical utility evidence if you are trying to establish a new Medicare benefit. And that is one of the challenges that we do see here. We are trying to, specifically on the hematuria evaluation side, trying to use biomarkers for that purpose, maybe establishing a new Medicare benefit. And that's why analytical validation and clinical validation are insufficient. But otherwise, analytical and clinical validation are sufficient for coverage by Medicare. Again, you have to meet you have to meet all of the criteria of a good analytical validation and clinical validation for that purpose, but that is how we structure things. And I know of no, that is the method. That is what the business should focus on. What that means is once you have the evidence, you of course have to submit it for a reconsideration request or the establishment of a new LCD if there is no Medicare benefit already. But again, in the Novitas jurisdiction, which follows the 21st Century Cures laws, you are expected to be paid on a claim-by-claim basis unless there is a non-coverage determination. And that is why the decision last Thursday is so significant for Pacific Edge, because claim-by-claim coverage is now no longer an option for us, and at least for the tests that are non-covered. And we need to do everything to reverse that.
Okay. And who will decide whether that preliminary injunction pauses the LCD? Is it up to the local courts or something? Or?
That is a federal court in the United States, yes.
Okay, cool. Hey, well, thank you so much, and best of luck, guys.
Thank you.
Your next question is from the line of Matt Montgomery from Forsyth Barr. Please go ahead.
Hi, guys. Good morning. Firstly, I'll echo Rob's comments with respect to condolences about the news. Maybe a slightly left field one to start. I was just wondering if, as part of the review of the scenario here, if there was consideration of changing lab location to, go outside of a Novitas jurisdiction as a means to CMS coverage.
Yeah, so look, there's a very convoluted and there's a long and convoluted answer to that question. The short answer is yes, we've considered it. No, it's not a good option. The reasons behind that, which I'm sure some of you will be interested in, is essentially timeline based. When you are in when you're in a MolDX jurisdiction, MolDX, because they were grandfathered in to the MolDX, the MolDX program was grandfathered in prior to the 21st Century Cures Act, which means they can preemptively non-cover tests until they've passed the technical assessment and various other milestones. So your pathway to recoverage through MolDX is longer. But yes, it is always an alternative avenue, and it is actually an important avenue to have available. But right now we believe it would be even longer to go through MolDX and then to go through Novitas.
Okay, that's clear. And then secondly, maybe on the reconsideration request process, I was just wondering if you could, elaborate on how that works, any precedents that you've seen within Novitas, and thirdly, wasn't that clear to me in response to one of Rob's questions that, is your view that the strata and the AV work enough of a grounds for reconsideration request, or are you going to wait for, say, the DRIVE study or others to come through?
It's a good point. You can make as many reconsideration requests as you want, but generally it's better to have something that's of high impact. The subtleties of this I will discuss internally with my medical affairs team, but I'll give you some of the basic thinking. So firstly, clinical utility evidence should be sufficient on its own to get coverage through a reconsideration request. And so the the strata publication should form the basis of that. But it is stronger if someone independent like the AUA has also read the strata publication and also formed a guideline on the basis of the strata publication, right? So we do believe that we can immediately submit the two that we have, but that it would be a stronger application if we have guidelines inclusion, and given the imminence of that potential, knowing the answer to that question may be worth waiting for. Those are things we'll determine within Pacific Edge, and we will advise investors through our quarterly updates. The reconsideration process itself is governed by the Program Integrity Manual. You can find a copy online, and it's often referred to as the PIM. The Program Integrity Manual requires that a reconsideration request is deemed valid by the Medicare Administrative Contractor within 60 days. Unfortunately, then, the MAC has huge discretion as to the following timelines, because there is no time bound on after deeming it valid, by which time it expires. However, once they have made a decision, it takes 45 days for it to come into effect. But I think was also in your question is, what's typical? And given that entire LCD construction, like a new LCD, is time bound by 12 months, what you typically see when you provide an individual paper for a single product for a reconsideration request is that they can turn that around in under 3 months. So that's the timeline that we work to when we make our calculations, but it is inherently open-ended and by the Program Integrity Manual.
So just to be clear, so the request needs to be filed within 60 days of what is that today, and then if it wasn't within that 60-day period, basically.
No, so it's slightly different.
Like,
so
they can wait.
We go to their website and we send them an email essentially saying we would like this new publication to be considered as under XYZ LCD. And they will say, we acknowledge receipt of this. From that date, they have 60 days to determine whether it has all of the appropriate documentation associated with the submission. And that includes, have we actually sent them peer-reviewed published information, or did we just send them, a recipe for a Georgie pie, right? Like, we've actually have we sent them something valid? And they will make that determination within 60 days. And they typically do take pretty close to the full 60 days to determine that, even though they could almost certainly determine it very, very quickly if they wanted to. After that point, that the submission has been deemed valid, they then have an unlimited amount of time to review the evidence, which is, again, in practice, that's less than 3 months for individual reconsideration requests based on single articles. Okay,
no, that's very clear. Secondly, maybe one for Chris here, just I guess in the context of the lengthy preparation around this decision and therefore operations review. I just want to try and get a sense of I guess the OPEX run rate here as we look to the future. Like, is historical OPEX levels prior to CMS coverage, acknowledging that research costs are different now than what they were then, sort of a decent way of thinking about it? Like, it's hard to get a sense of, I guess, the flexibility here without with the comments in the release.
Yeah, look, happy to take that. We have at least 45 days until to keep selling our product, and it will be reimbursed, and longer, perhaps, Pete, if some of this litigation opportunity we are successful in. So we are not of a mind yet to go leaping to sort of drastic OPEX reductions while we are still selling, still being reimbursed, and we have a legal process perhaps underway once we have some final legal advice. We certainly have a plan. In the worst of all worlds, if we were to lose, or not lose, but if we were not to get the AUA guidelines inclusions that we are seeking, and if we are not successful in our legal challenges, then we will have, we do have a plan to significantly reduce our operating expenditures until such time as we are recovered. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Maybe one for Pete, just on the research costs within the business. I think there's sort of 13 mil a year at the moment. Even in the event of an unsuccessful decision, is it fair to assume that level is broadly appropriate as you, I guess, deliver on the execution of more studies to then ultimately lead to positive outcomes in time around coverage and guidelines, etc.?
Yeah, I mean those costs are largely associated with the development of evidence and the product development and deployment and integration associated with the new products. So yes, those are all expected to be roughly the same.
But like, if we go to slide 8, I suppose, like, is that a level that we should be expecting for the next circa 3 years to deliver the current level?
Yes.
Cool. Thank you.
Your next question is from the line of Adrian Orbon from Jarden. Please go ahead.
Good morning, team.
Hey, Adrian.
Maybe firstly for you, Pete, just given you've sought some counsel from your legal advisors over the weekend, and I'm presuming this is a procedural potential challenge rather than a merits-based kind of challenge, even though you probably believe there's room for both. What sort of feedback have they given you in terms of other sort of successful cases, and what's the sort of bounds of cost to sort of take this procedural kind of basis forward if you chose to do that?
Yeah, look, appreciate the question. Those are the kinds of things that are going to get a no comment from me today. But rest assured, those conversations have been had with the lawyers. Those conversations have also been had at board level, and maybe I'll guide you a little bit on the cost associated with these kinds of things, because the United States is a place where you hear all the time about multi-million-dollar this, that, and the next thing. That's not the situation that we're in here. The type of legal advice that we are pursuing, and the type of litigation that we are considering is all in the low hundreds of thousands of US dollars, and that we think is entirely justifiable as a way to essentially put this to bed should we be successful.
Okay. Just maybe sort of a basic question in some respects. Let's just say that the coverage does cease on the 23rd of February. For our modelling purposes, if nothing else happened, would it be reasonable to assume that all of those Medicare volumes go in the following year? Because presumably, if you're not going to get reimbursed, why would you provide tests?
So there are reasons why we would provide tests, and that is again, if we have high confidence that let's imagine I guess a good scenario, all things considered. In 2 weeks, we get notified that Pacific Edge's or Cxbladder products have been included in AUA guidelines. At that point, the timing, the phasing would be such that we would lose coverage, but we would have something that has a very high likelihood of regaining coverage for one of our products. We would just continue to sell. right? Or at least we should consider the option to just continue to sell and just take a hit, even though we would not get paid on it until coverage is reestablished, because we don't want to turn away customers. So there are a lot of things to factor in, and I take none of those decisions lightly. We would take essentially, we know the value of our tests, and our customers know the value of our tests. And if they want to order it, we would shoot ourselves in the foot to stop allowing them to do so if it was only for a short period of time. But you're absolutely right. If we determine through some new information that we don't have today that coverage is actually further away than we anticipate, we can't continue to run as many tests as we are now.
Okay. And then like this is going back a few years, but like presumably, like say if you did continue to sell the tests and they're not reimbursed, and then you got coverage at some later point, is there any mechanism for clawback, or is that
the short answer is
possible?
no?
Because I know that was a
the short answer is no. It's from the date of service of recoverage, and so in fact, if the decision is made tomorrow that everything is recovered, we would still have to wait 45 days from tomorrow for that new coverage policy to come into effect. So there would still be a loss and a regain. The only way that we have no loss of coverage is if this is overturned.
Okay. And then just obviously that on the AUA guideline, like guideline inclusions, like what would sort of be a reasonable sort of time frame to consider that as a possibility? Like, does it reasonably require the publication of Drive first?
Sorry, Adrian, I missed part of the question there. Did you say guidelines inclusion based on Drive, or just coverage based on Drive?
Well, I guess if I trace back one step, like what would be the earliest possibility of an AUA guideline?
Yeah, the earliest possibility of an AUA guideline is what is under consideration right now. So again, the reason this might feel a little bit out of order is that typically there are LCDs which govern the medical policy, which are around the clinical utility of the test, and they already exist. And then if you know that something is already useful and has a Medicare benefit, all you need to do is be the new better mousetrap, right? And show analytical validation and clinical validation, and then your test is covered on that existing medical policy, that LCD. So you don't need clinical utility data. Guidelines works differently. Guidelines is actually the establishment of new medical policy, as is the creation of a new LCD. So that's the establishment of new medical policy. That's what they're supposed to be used for. And those both require clinical utility as well. So if you are being evaluated on an existing LCD where the medical policy and the clinical utility are established, then clinical validation, like Drive, is sufficient. What we've observed, though, is that even though there is an LCD, there is still a substantial misunderstanding around medical policy, which is why we needed clinical utility evidence that comes from Strata to really entrench our coverage position and move from this claim-by-claim coverage to saying, hey, any patient that presents with microhematuria is an eligible patient for this test. And that work has only been formally published, as of last year. Up until then, it's been case by case for a reason. And I hope that's not more confusing in the answer, but those are the details.
No. But essentially what you're saying is the AUA consideration, the main source of evidence other than your support within the urology groups is effectively the Strata data compounded by the Drive data when it's published.
So the AUA guidelines are most likely to make a decision based on Strata and subsequently Credible when Credible comes out. Credible is a long time away, 27 or 28 off the top of my head, and is for Triage Plus. But in the meantime, Strata is clinical utility evidence. It's compelling clinical utility evidence, and should be sufficient for some inclusion in guidelines.
Okay, so then can you just, maybe for simplicity, just what is the Drive data gain you in the process?
So the MACs, like Novitas, again, they typically only need analytical validation and clinical validation, and that is a clinical validation which we would submit on an existing LCD, not to a so it won't necessarily help with guidelines. It'll be required for guidelines for Credible and Triage Plus. But its primary utility is something that's focused on where there is existing medical policy and existing LCD, and saying we have an independently valid clinical validation of Triage Plus, and so it should be sufficient for Triage Plus to have coverage, not guidelines.
Okay, so that would be important for the reconsideration process with Novitas.
Yes.
Okay. And then maybe final question, like in your activating your contingency plans slide, at what point do you trigger the last bullet point where you like, or what's the sort of the gateway on that one where you're exploring other strategic alternatives? Like what do you mean by that?
It is intended as somewhat of a catch-all, where we are in regular dialogue with people that with organizations that could be of strategic value to our business, and we will continue to explore anything that will make sense for all of our investors and the future of our business. So it is intended to encompass a number of different possibilities without being specific about any one of them.
Okay, so funding, medical affairs support, all that sort of stuff.
It could include business development partnerships, new products, distribution, anything. It's a big bucket.
Okay, and then just sorry, I didn't say finally, but like in terms of the Kaiser, presumably you've spoken to Kaiser since this event. Is what you said previously, like previous in this conference call, is that they are still confident just to keep going on the track, so they're sort of not necessarily paying too much attention to what Novitas have come out and sort of finalised? Is that the right way to think about it, Kaiser, as you understand their position?
Yeah, so Kaiser make independent medical decisions, and we had a lot of this type of question 18 months ago or more about a contagion effect, and so again we believe that this is the contagion effect, such as it is Medicare and Medicare Advantage. It is not to other payers that make independent medical decisions, and Kaiser is one of those, and we have a contract with them that governs that. Kaiser are also very satisfied. That's really, really important. They are happy with the performance of the test. It is improving the care that they offer patients. It's improving the number of patients that an individual urologist can support. It's improving their economics, their clinical utility. So they are happy. Yes, they have also been reached out to by our US teams that manage Kaiser, and we will see what role, if any, beyond what's already been discussed, they can play in assisting us.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And before we take our next question, a further and final reminder to join the queue, please press *1 on your phone keypad. And your next question comes from the line of Fiona Rotherham from the NBR. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, good morning, Fiona.
Just wanted to ask, and we may be reading this wrong, but looking through the LCD determination, it would appear that Eurovision has got a test approved under that LCD, which is similar to your own. Can you sort of confirm anything about that?
Yeah, so given how many things we've had to read over the last couple of days, I have focused primarily on the things that affected CX Bladder, but I did notice that the comments related to fish, Eurovision fish, and Novitas specifically said that they became aware of 2 publications that they had not previously considered, that gave them the opportunity that when considered allowed them to revise their policy. So
is that a similar test to what you offer?
In a sense, fish has actually been a covered test for more than 20 years. It is old technology that actually works very, very poorly. And it's one of these anachronisms of the system that's something that it has FDA approval, and it has had NCCN guideline inclusion and AUA guideline inclusion for 20 years. It did lose NCCN guideline inclusion for what it's worth, but also for a narrow spectrum of patients. It's only used to resolve atypical and equivocal so that's atypical cytologies and equivocal cystoscopies, and in a surveillance setting. So those are it has limited application, but yes, it is similar in that it is a urine-based biomarker, but it has no ability to risk stratify patients, specifically hematuria patients, into those who need cystoscopy and those who do not. It's not suitable for that purpose.
So they wouldn't be able to gain ground that you may lose.
No, we can't see that. Plus, most people are rejecting fish in favour of tests like Cxbladder already. Yeah.
Okay.
And this concludes questions on the phone at this time. I turn the call back over to management for any online questions and closing remarks.
Great, thank you for that. Yes, there have been some online questions come through. I'll start with Paul's. He asked about the strategic alternatives, which you actually answered with a question. But he's asked, has Pacific Edge hired advisors to help with any of that work?
Chris, do you want to answer that question, or are you happy for me to? And Chris, you're on mute.
So sorry, Grant, you're very scrambled. I couldn't hear the first part of that question.
Sorry about that. Paul's question is around, has Pacific Edge engaged any external advisors to help with strategic alternatives?
No. Other than we are in regular contact with a number of strategic advisors in this space, but we haven't formally engaged an advisor to take us down that path.
Thanks, Chris. Next question is from Terry. They strongly recommend a preliminary injunction, but can you tell me if you've been advised whether we have standing or jurisdiction before the US court?
Again, look, these are legal nuances. The high level question is that is yet to be fully established, but that is the guidance from our lawyers at this time is we have both of those. Yes. But that is a decision for the courts. You can file whatever you want, and then they have to deem that you do. We will have to demonstrate irreparable harm to the business. I don't think that's going to be difficult at all. And we also have to demonstrate that there are clear procedural violations and clear law. And one of the things that we feel reasonably confident about is that the process that this LCD has followed has not been consistent with Medicare's procedures, not the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law. So crafting that into legal arguments is what we pay them the dollars for. And I believe we have among the best counsel in the world for this purpose.
Right. Thank you. Richard's question is next. A single test that received funding approval via this LCD is Eurovision Fish. That test was described in the approval comments of FDA approved, and I believe is the only test among those evaluated by this LCD that is FDA approval. How much weight does FDA approval carry when it comes to securing Novitas approval, and will gaining FDA approval benefits Cxbladder?
Gosh, it turns out that is a very, very deep and convoluted answer, and I would like to shy away from deep and convoluted answers. But the short answer is that FDA approval can pretty much never hurt. But typically, due to the extra burden and rigor required for FDA approval, businesses in our space tend to focus on getting coverage first. So it's reimbursement rather than the regulatory side. And again, that part of that has been driven by the historical enforcement discretion, which we also know is no longer in effect. And so it is a changing landscape. But the short answer to your question is continuing to pursue FDA approval is definitely a long-term beneficial, but it is unlikely to ever be considered the sole basis for coverage. Novitas would never go, oh, it's got FDA approval, we'll just cover that. That's never really been the case.
Thank you. Daryl's got the next question. Novitas has a contract with Medicare. How often does the contract come up for review? And are there any other companies that may take the contract in the future?
That is a great question. I don't know the details of that, but it's of the order of 5 to 7 years that the contracts last for, or at least that the jurisdictions are signed for. So they can bid for different jurisdictions at different times, and there is a rolling schedule, and someone more informed than myself about those specifics can give you the details, and it's possibly also available online. But the short answer, again, to your question is yes, their contracts will expire. They will have to competitively bid for them. The existing players, are obviously the other MACs, and it does change from time to time.
Great. Andrew's got the next question, second to last. My understanding is that the AUA guidelines have different levels. Would a lower level AUA guideline inclusion be less persuasive for Novitas?
It's less about AUA guideline levels and more about within the AUA guideline, what is the level of evidence that supports that? For what it's worth, the level of evidence that supports cystoscopy is not level 1. I think it's actually like level 3 or C or something like that, off the top of my head. But I defer to my medical affairs colleagues on these matters. But it is not in the same category as a randomized controlled trial. And so actually, if you just look at it from a category of evidence perspective, Strata is the highest level of clinical evidence that can be considered by the AUA.
Great. Sorry, there's another question that's come in. So this is the second last. From Ramesh. Can Pacific Edge's success with Kaiser be replicated all over the US? Are there any reasons why they're only covering California?
I guess I guess there's two ways to interpret that question. Right now we are well utilized within the Southern California region of the Kaiser system, and Kaiser has, and that is about 1/3 of the Kaiser system. The next third is Northern California, and all of the rest, Hawaii, Alaska, Mid-Atlantic, and various other places, altogether are roughly another third of the business. So to the extent that the question is about moving through the rest of the Kaiser system, we are of course working on that. We have been for some time, and we believe we have a very clear value proposition, and it's mostly about following an institutional sales process to ensure that we are implemented and paid for in those other jurisdictions within Kaiser. But if you're asking the question, can our success with Kaiser be replicated in the health system writ large? Again, I also believe absolutely the answer is yes. But what is important is that you definitely require Medicare coverage, and you definitely require guidelines inclusion to be able to have a little bit more of sort of top-down decision-making rather than individual bottom-up decision-making from physicians. And that is, of course, why we have our evidence generation program focused on those two things. When we have those two things in place, our sales process becomes much more streamlined, and we should see an uptick in our business performance. And again, we believe we're very, very close to both of those. This is obviously a setback, but we will continue.
Thank you. And the last question from online. What impact could the new administration in the US play? Could they dramatically change Novitas's leadership and direction?
So short answer, no. The MACs are private companies, and in fact, Novitas and First Coast, are both MACs, are owned by a parent company, Guidewell. Guidewell is owned by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida, right? Like there's a convoluted network of private companies that are bidding on these government contracts. So as far as MACs are concerned, I don't think that the change of administration is important. However, the change in administration can affect your political lobbying efforts. And Pacific Edge doesn't currently engage deeply in political lobbying efforts, but it may be possible to find various congressmen, senators who are interested in helping to support, for example, veterans with bladder cancer in a way that they are currently not being supported by the Biden administration or something like that. So change in priorities can affect things at a political level, and Pacific Edge largely does not operate in that space at this time.
That's the end of the questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much to everyone who has dialed in to listen. We appreciate that this is a difficult time for investors, and I deeply appreciate the support from our investment community, our board, my management team, and of course all of my staff who have worked very, very hard to get us to this point. And also in the most recent, very hard over the weekend to help get a lot of the programs of work that we know we need to initiate in this situation underway, and we expect to give the market updates in our quarterly update, both one that is more or less immediate regarding the end of Q3, but also through Q4, and anything material that comes up, you will be notified in real time. We thank you for your patience and your understanding. Have a good afternoon.